Well, hello, my friends, and welcome back to BiblioFiles.
It's BiblioFiles.
Here we are.
It's time.
Finally.
Let's go.
Once again, some more BiblioFiles episodes. We've just been hard at work trying to come up with a season to bring to you guys, and we're really excited about the one that we have developed. As always, I'm your host, Ian Andrews, joined today by the co-directors of CenterForLit and my parents, Adam and Missy. How you guys doing?
Good, Ian
well.
boy.
Yeah,
Good to see you.
well.
Hey, Mom, we should name you so that the any of our listeners who decide to find us on YouTube can see your name under your face. I did it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't
No, you're
rename
good.
myself. And did I? Was I just
Yeah,
Adam
very
Andrews
good.
again?
You were Adam Andrews again.
was.
We're all Adam Andrews.
Sorry.
It's just how it works. Well, welcome back, my friends. I'm so excited to tackle this. The topic for this season, as you've heard in our intro, is juvenile fiction and or YA, young adult fiction. And I got to confess to you, this has been a hot button issue for many years around the Andrews dinner table, for reasons that I think Missy will have a lot to tell us about. But a framing of the topic is that over the last, couple of decades, probably more, there has developed a division in the library on the shelves between what is traditionally considered juvenile fiction. I'm thinking the likes of G.A. Henty, for example, stories for young people, and young adult fiction, which ever increasingly in recent years has been darker, a little more postmodern, often dystopian, and dealing with some adult themes in ways that at least purport to be aimed at younger readers. And this distinction is a confusing one for us at CenterForLit, and I would like to spend our introductory episode talking a bit about that. So what say the two of you? Is there a distinction between juvenile fiction and young adult fiction? And maybe more importantly, should there be a distinction between those things?
Before you dive in, Missy, and I know you have lots of things to say about this, I just want to plead ignorance about the distinction and say, when you first say out loud, we want to talk about juvenile fiction, I want to tell you what my mind immediately jumps to. Maybe that's a good place to start as
It's a great place to start.
Where I immediately jump to is Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson and Little House on the Prairie by Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Right.
And I think when you say juvenile fiction, I think that's the genre, that's the reading level. Those are that's symbolic representative of the classics of that genre.
Right.
And I think about it in this way: books that are appropriate for young readers, but not necessarily exclusively to be read by young readers. And
right.
I think
because we can enjoy Treasure Island as grown-ups.
And should.
Right, exactly.
Right? I mean, I think one of the glories of juvenile fiction, as I understand the term in the category, is that it is to be read by readers who are young or old. And so in a sense, it has broader appeal than adult fiction, not narrower appeal.
That's a great point. What comes up in your mind when I say, what is young adult fiction or YA fiction?
Well, I'll go ahead and be a guinea pig here. Because of what I just said about my sort of instinctive definition of juvenile fiction, I would say Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island in particular.
Yeah.
Because as an adult, I think it's great. And as a young adult, I thought it was great. And so I think maybe that I am with you on the need to discuss the distinction. Maybe that's a distinction that I didn't grow up with and is something that needs chewing on.
I think it's interesting you say it's a distinction you didn't grow up with. And it probably is because you grew up in a Christian home where you were sheltered from the growing category that was distinguished, I think, beginning in 1960 is when they came up with the term YA fiction.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that.
Yeah, because there was a tone change and there was a new kind of fiction emerging that was targeting a particular audience at this period that was not really the JF audience, the juvenile fiction audience, as it had previously been understood. The YA term takes in, some people say ages, about 12 to 18. Some people go as
that's
late
broad.
as 20. Yeah. Others say, no, 12 is still the JF category. We'd say 14 to 18 or 20. And then, of course, there's another newer category that's piggybacking on YA, and it's like new adult or something like that. They're cubby-holing more and more the various age groups. And
what do you think the impulse is
suggesting-
behind this kind of further distinction?
Well, I think that initially it was developed to suggest a turn towards a narrator that is peculiarly interested in subject matter that is only interesting to children that age. Okay?
Oh, I see.
It usually has a protagonist that's in that span of years, going through issues that that the people who created this term say are peculiar to that period of life. And I would add to that the first truly YA work of literature, they say it was The Outsiders. And then let's see, it piggybacked on top of that with other books that came out right on the heels of that. But it had a young narrative voice. It was written by a young person. I think when S.E. Hinton wrote it, he was like 16 years old.
Did not know that.
And
Wow.
so thus had a fresh, young approach or vision of the world and reality. Usually when people talk about YA fiction, they're talking about a particular type of realistic fiction that portrays that period of life without any kind of idealistic retrospective halo, right? This is the idea of YA fiction.
So
it's a little gritty.
It's books about teenagers written by teenagers?
No, not necessarily. Hinton was a teenager when he wrote, but it's a book about the teenage years, right? That's supposed to be written realistically, quote unquote. Like,
okay.
So that means now increasingly dark, right? Because of the cultural trends, the cultural, I think, sentiment towards truth and reality and ideas as we redefine reality culturally, moving more and more into postmodern, and then now they're calling it post-Christian ideas that have crept in socially to determine cultural values, and all of those cultural values then are becoming critics of the things that are being produced, artistically speaking, right?
Right.
The kinds of subject matter the YA fiction in particular is dealing with is increasingly, let's say, divergent. Let's say, instead of
nice reference.
Yeah, instead of producing for that age category works of art that would envision things as they ought to be, they fixate on the not the norm, but the paranormal. And I don't mean that supernaturally. I mean divergent
outliers.
Activities. Yeah, outliers.
Yes. But the reason that it still has the label YA is because of young protagonists, right?
Yes, but not just young, but peculiarly kids that are between the ages of like 14 and 18, right?
Okay.
And sets them aside as subhuman in a way. That's a terrible thing to say. I don't mean that.
Let me stop you there.
In their outlook.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And what it makes me question, first of all, I have lots of questions, but the main one is this a step away from what we would call good art at CenterForLit? We would talk about universality of thematic content,
right?
A really good work of art is asking questions and sometimes providing answers, but mostly asking questions that are essentially human ones.
Right.
The people across times, across cultures, across faiths can all identify with. Is the impulse to write YA fiction a step away from that kind of universality in your view?
I think so, but I think probably if someone who is a proponent of YA fiction, which I am not, were here to argue with me, they'd say it's universal in terms of the experience of a person that age. But what I was going to go on to say is that because it doesn't focus on what's normative, but instead on what's aberrant, many of the critics of YA, myself included, think that it normalizes aberrant behaviors. And, in our increasingly minority-driven world, and I don't mean that racially, I mean that minority groups with agendas tend to be driving the ship in our world these days, culturally speaking. I think that degenerates really rapidly into using this particular genre, it's not genre, a category of literature to do what all postmodern written words do. That is to influence politically. Because, there was a great article by Megan Cox Gurdon for Hillsdale's Imprimis not too many years ago that was called The Case for Good Taste in Children's Literature. And it was just after she'd been attacked for writing a piece suggesting that this YA stuff that's being written these days is increasingly dark and that there need to be some gatekeepers, that is, tastemakers, standing between the young people that it's meant for and the literature itself, because we all know that literature influences, right? It doesn't just reflect life, it actually tends to influence people's behavior in life. And so if we give people a steady diet of aberrant things in literature, we may be normalizing aberrant behaviors, right?
Or at the very least, aberrant expectations of what life is going to look like.
Yes, aberrant ideas of what quote unquote reality really is. Whereas a more classic view of literature would say that we hold up and depict truth, that is capital T truth, that is transcendent, right? And recommend it as a normalizing influence for people who are living in a fallen world where truth has been marred, who are down in the muck and the dirt and struggling to find some sort of hope. That capital T truth is the hope that not just children or young adults need, but that everyone needs. And so that would fall more in line, I think, artistically with what Dad was suggesting, that he perceives juvenile fiction and young adult fiction and good fiction as a whole to be, right?
Okay, so we're going to start in on this question and see where it takes us. But when I think about fiction in general, we're not often writing about something ultimately normative. In fact, that movement, that kind of realism movement, this is what life actually looks like, is more or less recent.
Right.
Usually when we set out to write a story, we are writing about something that is aberrant, has a negative connotation, but extraordinary.
Extraordinary is the word you're looking for.
Well, imaginative is what I would say. Imaginative. That's
Well,
different.
No, I think extraordinary is the word he's looking for. The travels of Odysseus are extraordinary, and that's why we're interested.
Right. But what they reveal about human nature and about the questions that beset mankind in their hearts, those are ultimately normal and universal, right? So that kind of a distinction seems to be important here. I'm not exactly sure.
When I'm talking about YA, I'm not, and it's divergent nature, right? The gritty realism, and it's a tendency to focus on problems, right?
Sure.
I don't mean all literature focuses on problems, and all fiction deals with the imagination, right?
Right.
Imaginary worlds, imaginary travels, larger than life things. Especially when we're talking about the epics, but that's not what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about YA's fixation on problems, I'm not talking about just a conflict at the heart of the story. I'm talking about kids that cut themselves. You see what I mean by the minorities?
I think I do.
The minorities driving the ship here, right?
In terms of
setting the direction, in terms of subject matter. Yeah, and if you look at postmodern ideas of what literature actually is. If we go back and we see the origins of this, what I think this growing movement was since the 1960s to the present day, it's totally associated with postmodern understandings of reading and reading as a project.
Yeah.
Because postmodernists deny meaning. altogether. Like they even question the symbolic meaning of words on the page, right? They say we
Right.
can only decide in small communities, we can come to some agreement from one person to the other and agree about meanings of words and things. But cross-culturally, like we couldn't even read something multicultural because how could we possibly think we could understand anything written by so-and-so?
Let me jump in here. I think that's an interesting thing that you're saying when you talk about the postmodernist suspicion about overarching meaning, because what it does in art is it leads to since we can't be talking about universally applicable concepts, the postmodern worldview eventually has to be content with describing local events. And since there's no, meta narrative, as they would put it, the description of local events is all that's left. And so literature in particular, and maybe art generally, goes from it has to change purpose and change focus and change function from calling the mind and the heart up to considering what is universal and may exist beyond your time and place.
That is meaning, truth.
Meaning to instead describing what you see in your time and place and trying to create some meaning out of that. And that's where you get the impulse of the artist to want to give everyone a voice. And I think there's an important distinction here. Art that's preoccupied with the plight of various minority groups or various outsider groups is kind of caught in an implication of this deconstructionist worldview. Since I can't talk about universal meaning, all I can do is hope that a member of a particular outsider group who has this very limited, very specific experience will be able to find a voice and create his or her meaning in this work of art. And so we get authors who say, the world actually does contain these kinds of aberrant behavior, and art should reflect this kind of aberrant behavior, therefore, and people that participate in this aberrant behavior or belong to these outsider groups need to find expression. They need to see themselves. And I guess what I want to say is one of the reasons that we're doing this in this YA genre is because literature has been limited by the effective deconstruction movement to this purpose only, to reflect the experience of specific time-bound, space-bound local communities.
And I would go further to say that in that kind of a climate, a postmodern climate, since there is no overarching, as you say there, in their words, no overarching meta-narrative, that is no actual capital T truth to hold up for us all to contemplate. Instead, we get little localized narratives that look a lot like special interest groups. And then the writing and publication of literature is like a war where we each propagate our tiny little narrative and we fight for some sort of power for our special interest group on the larger stage of the culture, which is exactly what we see going on in literature and in publishing. Like it's harder and harder for someone who has a quote unquote traditional or conservative understanding of truth to be published by the larger publishing companies because they have these people whose job it is to read for sensitivity, right? Sensitivity readers. And basically what they're doing is they're combing through the stuff that is up for publication to see if it's going to upset any of the special interest groups who are lobbying for voice and ascendance in the culture.
I want to jump. I got to say one other thing. You say that it's the conservatives that get marginalized in this process. And I think it's true, but I think the real issue is broader than that. It's not necessarily the conservatives that get marginalized. It's the folks who want to say there is a meta narrative.
That's what I meant by conservative. I did not mean political conservatives, although I think they sometimes overlap. I mean people who are interested in conserving truth as something that exists out there. And that takes in people with various ideas of what that truth might be, right?
Well, the
idea that there is something that is true, that is objective, that stands outside of me and my tiny little community and might have something to say to us.
Right.
That idea is a conservative view in literature that would want to conserve the classics, right? As being things that partake of transcendence, right? The
Mm.
transcendent ideas, what you called universal ideas, Adam.
Yeah.
That connect people from time to time and place to place and culture to culture.
And I want to interject here for just a second, because I, as a listener to the show at this point in the episode, I could have heard down with all postmodern works of fiction. Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald can shove it. And that is not at all what we're trying to say, because Hemingway and Fitzgerald actually also agree that there's a meta narrative. The vision of the meta narrative that they put forth in their fiction is awful bleak, and we don't necessarily agree with it, but their works do partake of universal questions that they hope have some kind of universal answer.
Yeah.
And I agree with Mom that the issue I'm seeing in young adult fiction is that it doesn't talk about the meta very much.
Right.
No.
If it
Yeah.
acknowledges that it exists, it generally stands as some sort of persecution on the heroic individuality of the main character.
Well,
Yeah.
it's
Yep, go ahead,
predicated
Missy.
on the angst and alienation that we're supposed to believe is the necessary determining factor of the teenage years.
Yeah, that's well said.
Right?
That's well said.
Yeah.
That's what teenagers are all about, is angst and alienation. And it comes in various forms. We mentioned cutting or questioning our gender or whatever, whatever the preoccupation of the individual whose special interest group is writing it is fixated on.
Something you said, bringing up Hemingway and Fitzgerald in this connection, I think requires comment, because first of all, The Great Gatsby is a great depiction of alienation and the kinds of things that we're talking about with respect to YA fiction.
Yeah.
But it has the distinction of not actually being postmodern. It's actually pre-postmodern. It's just modern.
It's just modern.
Yeah.
And the goal of a modernist writer is far distinct, I think, from the goal of a postmodernist writer. The goal of a modernist writer is at the very extremity to bemoan and to bewail the crumbling of certainty.
Yeah.
And to say there's got to be certainty. So maybe we're losing it, but it's very necessary. And the loss of it is a disaster. And to say that in a universally compelling way, to say this is a universal truth, that the loss of certainty is a disaster. And so Fitzgerald does what the modern YA author might do, but not from a postmodern perspective.
Well, and he's also not doing it with teenagers, by and large.
Fair enough.
He's writing for adults.
Definitely writing
this is
to
adult
adults.
literature. I'm talking about literature that's termed YA.
I know that. I know that.
Yeah.
I was just taking issue with Ian's use of Hemingway and Fitzgerald in this connection.
That's fair. I will stand corrected on that front. I just want to be careful with our terminology, because in particular, anyone that's been around CenterForLit for a long time, listening to us talk, knows well our affinity for the classics and for the world of certainty, as you put it, right? A world in which asking questions about the nature of God is possible because it is assumed there is one.
Right.
We would prefer to live in that world and to read in that world, and grappling in our own ways with the fact that we don't necessarily anymore, at least not on all fronts, has been a difficult conversation for years now. And so I want to make sure we place ourselves in that conversation carefully, to step away from the content of these YA books for just a minute, and talk about maybe some authors that use this YA distinction to their advantage to do some things that we do agree with. Because as you said earlier, Mom, I think not all proponents of YA would agree with our characterization. Some of them would say, no, it's because of all the things that you're saying. It's because of all the truth that there is in teenagers as a class in our culture and society, and the way that they are targets culturally and the way that they're being manipulated, that we write specifically to them about their issues. Have you seen that done well? And furthermore, is that something that we can actually call, because we love to redefine terms around here, juvenile fiction instead of YA fiction?
Great question.
Like, do you think that the growing use of YA and targeting that particular age group is necessarily a good thing? Is that what you're asking? Yeah.
Is it good or bad? I mean, has it been done well, I guess is what I'm saying.
I turn immediately to Gary Schmidt.
Me too.
One of my personal novelistic heroes, author heroes. That man is, he's an amazing author and a Christian who's very thoughtful, who has looked at this YA term, and I shouldn't say this because I haven't spoken to him personally about this, and maybe this is something his publisher did when he wrote the book that I'm about to name, but he seems to have waded into YA fiction and regarded it as it is a coming of age period. This is coming of age literature. This is what's going on between the ages of 12 or 14 and 18 or 20. We're coming of age. We're starting to ask all of the significant questions. Life is happening to us, and sometimes in really painful ways that we have to reconcile with.
Right.
And in that, the cataloging of all the particulars to YA literature fades into just literature. Right. A lot of literature deals with coming of age, and it happens at various stages of life. We come of age again and again and again, right? As we encounter more and more of the difficulty of what it is to be a human being in the world.
Right. Right.
And it looks like he's just said, all right, well, YA literature has characters that are about this age and they're coming of age in some way. And oftentimes it's problematic. And let's deal with that. And so he writes Orbiting Jupiter about a young man who gets his girlfriend pregnant out of wedlock. And
As a teenager.
Yeah. As a teenager, and who ends up in a boys' home. He's from a really difficult background himself. His father is very unbalanced, and he is adopted is the wrong word, fostered by a Christian family at one point in the story. And it's through one of the sons in the story, through his voice, that we hear what goes down with this boy, the troubles that he deals with as he's trying to reconcile his kind of dark experience with the experiences he sees around him in the local public high school, for example, because the things that have happened to him and the things that he has done fall outside the boundaries of what is normal for a person his age. And I think Schmidt did a beautiful job of reconciling the fact that that occurs for some young people without suggesting that that is normal for all young people, by including and telling the story through a normal young person, through their mouth and their eyes, witnessing the darkness. Because more and more, that is a recurrent story for our children. And most of our young children, our young adults, know people that are struggling with abnormal behavior qualities. Whether that's they're doing violence to themselves, or they're taking drugs, or they're drinking too heavily, or they're questioning their gender because they're told that's what they're supposed to do. There are all kinds of things that our young children in Christian homes are seeing that they're trying to reconcile themselves with.
And so ignoring those things altogether would not be a very compassionate way to write heart.
No, it wouldn't.
We have to address it somehow. But I like the distinction that you're drawing, that we don't call it normative.
No, he's not normalizing those behaviors in any way or suggesting that we should. Instead, he's acknowledging that some of those behaviors are existing, and he's having a normal Christian boy in a Christian home experience vicariously, not the sordid, dirty experience of wading into a premarital sexual experience, but watching a boy who did haphazardly end up in a situation like that, and who is contemplating the grave consequences that were attached to it that he just didn't know, and the way that it's tipped his boat over, right? Try to come back to center, try to right his boat in a foster care environment that has a Christian mom and dad at the helm, and simultaneously wade through a school experience that doesn't seem to acknowledge the darkness that he's experienced in his own life. Right. I think Gary Schmidt did a beautiful job, and I think he's taken a lot of grief from conservative communities, the conservative Christian community, for even writing in this particular,
for even taking up these issues.
Yes, but I think he it seems like he said, okay, I see that this genre or this age category, this new kind of literature is being written. How can I wade into this with a different voice and
Yeah,
offer to the kids who are swimming around in the YA bookshelves something that might partake of universality and hope and transcendence and beauty and goodness and truth? You know what I mean?
I
Um,
do. Yeah.
it's a
Yeah,
rare voice in YA bookshelves. That's what I'll say.
yeah, I think I agree with you. It's just maybe the reason for the season.
Mhm.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
pretty funny.
Here's what I find, Ian. I did a quick search getting ready for for our conversation today. The best of 2022's YA fiction, and among them, see, there is a book called "Beating Heart Baby" by Leo Min about a trans boy, an emo trans boy. There's another one by Melinda Lowe about a queer girl coming out called A Scatter of Light.
Mm.
There is one by Jen Ferguson that talks about a biracial girl wrestling with sexual pressures out of wedlock as a teenager called The Summer of Bitter and Sweet. There's another one that is a self-conscious rewrite of F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby called Self-Made Boys, written by Anne Marie McLemore. Anyway, in which she recasts Nick and Gatsby as trans boys in a love triangle with the interloper Daisy.
Wow.
So, this was a very quick, tell me the best of this particular category of fiction for 2022. And, that's just a handful. This is what comes up. And there was worse. It's dark stuff. And it seems to be intentionally a gaze into what's aberrant. I follow Megan Gurdon into the question of to what good end? I hear Dad saying, well, this is totally consistent with the postmodern mood, giving everyone a voice. But what I see it doing is normalizing abnormal behavior patterns and recommending them to a whole generation of teenagers who are, because of their age, right, asking questions about what is real, what's the nature of reality, right? What is a man? What is a woman? What is a marriage? What is a love? These are the questions that that constitute the human experience, right? That is the experience and the questions that all men, that is all mature thinkers, come up against. And what is a teenager, a young adult doing but starting to watch themselves think about these ideas and to offer them just a smorgasbord of aberrant ideas about that, basically editing out any kind of overarching truth.
Yeah, well, so I I've thought about
Seems to
that.
be really
I do think that
fact-minded.
it's actually offering an overarching truth. It's just one that I think might be a departure from the literary tradition of Western thought. And the truth I see it offering, and I want to hear Dad's thoughts on this, is the defiant individual who is heroic because they are defending their own truth against assertions from all sides about what truth is and what it looks like.
I think that's perfectly consistent with the philosophical corner that the postmodern mood has worked us into. If there's no universal, if there's no transcendent meaning, then I must create my own. And what I have to go on in terms of the materials to create my own meaning is the materials of my own experience and my own identity, which is self-created.
Right.
And my only play is to say, I deserve a voice.
Right.
And what's inside my heart is the ground I'm going to stand on to make myself something. And as this works its way out in philosophy and in political action and in art in exactly this way. And it's really, it's not I was talking with somebody recently that said the problem with a particular set of what I would call aberrant behaviors in the public school is that those kids have no one to love them. And so what we should do is support them and confirm them and validate them in their particular behavior because of their isolation. And it's a self-defeating project. And as it works its way out in art, it's a self-defeating project too, because reinforcing the idea that we are all completely isolated and alone in the absence of a meta narrative or in the absence of any transcendent things that connect us, to reinforce that with art is to make the problem worse,
especially since we leave them in,
since it's not in fact true. And here's where we have to come down eventually. We eventually have to say, we stand on the side, not only of truth, but even before that, we stand on the side of the proposition that truth exists.
Right.
We stand on the side of those who say there is a truth out there.
Yeah.
Even in disagreeing with people as to what it might look like, we stand in solidarity with all of those who say it's out there and it is to be strived for and grasped. And that is one of the reasons that we make art.
So draw that connection for me explicitly, just for the sake of our listeners, back into the juvenile fiction of a bygone era. How does juvenile fiction as a genre, quote unquote, as distinct from YA, affirm the proposition that you just made?
Okay, Lord of the Flies.
Okay.
You might say Lord of the Flies is a picture of scariness. It's a totally dystopian. It's crazy aberrant behavior. But the whole cast of Lord of the Flies is, oh my goodness, what a scary thing.
Right.
Terrible things could happen when immature people without adult supervision get lost on an island. You could get cannibalism and execution.
Yeah.
That is not safe. That is not good.
Right.
That is wrong.
It's the blind leading the blind.
Yes, and the blind leading the blind. And that to take that position, the position that Lord of the Flies takes on that situation, is to stand in the tradition of what C.S. Lewis called the Tao, right? There are rules about that sort of thing. They bind us all everywhere. And to tell a dystopian story is in part to say that dystopian is a thing.
Yes.
Right.
And there's only such a thing as dystopian if there's such a thing as topian.
That's right.
If you know what I mean.
I like that.
That's
great.
good.
And so I would say that the most dystopian of all, juvenile literature of a bygone era stands in that tradition. And that's what makes it good.
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think that it's the ultimate outworkings of the discarding of truth and the meta narrative, right? What we're getting here. And it's sad. It does leave kids in a dark, dark room and gives them nothing but, misery loves company, I don't know. As I looked at peculiar features of the YA novel, there's a fixation on the present tense. It's usually written either in third person omniscient or first person point of view, to generate this sense of immediacy. And every example that I was given online about what is this YA genre or this YA division of literature, there's this reference to the immediacy of the writing style. Everything is done in the moment, in the present tense for the protagonist.
It's all carpe diem.
Yes, it's all carpe diem, which lacks any kind of perspective, right? Any kind of mature distance from,
the
for example,
author
just
does not
the
stand
hormones,
as an interpreter.
right? No, there's no interpretation of reality because there is no meta narrative, right? Yeah. There's only what's going on inside. And if there's no outside light to be shown into the inside, we're all just left, as C.S. Lewis said, with ourselves. Yeah. And that we don't get eyes, the eyes of others by which to see the world, gain perspective, understand something that's cohesive, that holds us together, and that holds the center together for us and in us, and speaks into our hearts with some sort of light.
That's interesting. The way that just presented itself to me as you were talking is that an author that we would stand behind, that we would support in talking about the truth, asking universal questions, is saying to their reader, here I am, you're probably just like me. And the author of YA fiction that you're describing right now is saying only, I see you.
That's a good point.
I see you, and I'm going to leave you right where you are. You're fine.
You're fine. Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting
the point I want to make, though,
problems and keep
hold on. The point that I want to make, though, is that, because here's what I don't want to do. I don't want a listener to our show who aims to write YA fiction with the rest of their days, who feels called to that genre, to that age of student or of reader, to hear this is a bankrupt project. I think the impulse is actually the same one. It's benighted in some ways for the philosophical reasons that we're describing, but the impulse is still to reach out to the reader with compassion. And for that reason, there will be a couple of times in this season, a couple of episodes where we talk about some YA writers that are doing a tremendous job of it. You've already mentioned Gary Schmidt, whom I think will probably get his own episode later on. Another man who might get his own episode is John Green, who does very much more than say, I see you. Yeah. He says, I see you and I love you and I struggle the way that you struggle and I'm a grown up. And it's moving and transcendent and wonderful, even though it could only be called YA, and shares many of the distinctors you just mentioned about immediacy and first person narrator and all of those sorts of things. So we aren't trying to, I hasten to say, we aren't trying to cast down the genre as a whole, but I do think this conversation about the distinction between YA and juvenile fiction is merited based on all the things that we've been talking about.
Well, and I kind of wonder if, given the fact that there is the subcategory now that is called YA, understanding the contours of it and the things that make a book qualify as YA would allow Christian artists to wade into that peculiar category and put some books on the bookshelf in that area of the library or the bookstore that might offer something transcendent to their readers, that might shine a light into a very, very dark corner
of the library.
Yes, of the library. And that would be a really worthy project.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh man, that's excellent. Good. Well, thank you both for joining me, and thank you listeners for joining us. Really excited about these conversations as we go along. Episodes in this season will include Adam and Missy at various times, along with Megan and Emily as well. So please do continue to tune in wherever you get your podcasts, and join us on Facebook and drop us a line. We'd love to hear recommendations from you. We will, of course, offer all sorts of recommendations ourselves as the season goes along. So until we meet again, my friends, happy reading.
Happy reading, everybody.
Reading.